Tennessee and Georgia, the college football playoff, a talking point for both fan bases and deservedly so. Obviously, this coming weekend has a huge impact on what their postseason will look like, right? I mean, forget the SEC title game. Well, don't forget it, but outside of the SEC title game, you probably feel like if you can just get there undefeated, if you're either one of these programs, you have a pretty decent shot to make the college football playoffs. So let's unpack that a little bit. The path for Alabama is clear. If they win out as a one-loss SEC champion, they're not getting left out. There's really no way around it. There's no other sort of talking point that needs to be had here. If you're Alabama, handle business, win the SEC, you're dancing, right? Now, for Tennessee and Georgia, it's not necessarily a given that if you were to be second place in the SEC, for lack of a better term, you win this coming game against Tennessee or Georgia, whoever it is, and you get to that title game in Atlanta, undefeated. If you lose, it's not just a layup that you make the college football playoff. So I want to break this down. I think we have the graphic, Nick, so if we can pull that up. That'd be phenomenal. Here is the doomsday scenario if you're one of these fan bases, because there's two undefeated potential conference champions still out there. A Big Ten champ is in. Whether they're one loss or undefeated, they're in. An SEC champion, they're in. Whether it's one loss or undefeated, they're in. So let's just say, for example, in this scenario, that's Bama. You still have two spots, and a Big 12 undefeated champion and an ACC undefeated champion, let's say TCU for the Big 12 and Clemson for the ACC, that would occupy all the spots. So a second-place SEC team, as impressive as they are, no matter what happens in that game, how close it is, you would be left out. Now, whether we agree with it or not really here to talk about that. That's just the reality. A lot of these situations when it comes to Selection Sunday, they're people in a room, right? So you're weighing resumes and things like that. What it comes down to is you're having a conversation. And I think the conversation is a lot shorter if that's what happens. So that's kind of the extra team SEC lockout potential scenario, if you're with me there. So here's where I think it could be a little bit more of a talking point when it comes to that second team from the SEC making it. Here's where I stand on that. If you're a one-loss SEC runner-up, I think you're the first team off the bench. So in that scenario, you need either a one-loss Clemson as your ACC champion. They still have a game at Notre Dame this coming weekend. They have Louisville, which has gotten progressively more interesting after what they did to Wake Forest this past weekend. You got Miami, you got South Carolina, then you got the ACC title game. All right? So you, in theory, would need them to lose one of those games, especially, if they lose the ACC title game, forget it. The ACC is not going to have a team. But if they lose one along the way and win the ACC, I still have a hard time taking them over whoever that second-place team is in the SEC with one loss. All right, so that's that. You also, in theory, or either or, I guess is the scenario, is a one-loss Big 12 champion, TCU. They still have Texas Tech. They go to Texas, which will likely be a ranked matchup, depending on what Texas does this week at Kansas State. And you got at Baylor, you got Iowa State, and then you would have the Big 12 title game. So, again, either one of those scenarios happens. In either conference, the SEC is the first team in my humble opinion. I like the resume more for either of these programs over a team that's the Ohio State or Michigan loser, to put it simply. That's where I fall on that. So here's where it gets interesting. Let's start with Georgia. Let's say you lose this weekend to Tennessee, and let's say that Tennessee ends up winning the SEC title. All right, so you have a two-loss Bama, which helps you. And here are some other things that I think you got to look at. The conversation gets harder. In my mind, you would need both a one-loss ACC champion and a Big 12 champion with one loss. I think you would also like to have the Pac-12 champion be either Oregon or a two-loss Utah team. Now, the reason why I say you'd want it to be Oregon is because you have that head-to-head with Oregon. And that head-to-head wasn't close, right? It was 49-3. We all saw it. We all watched that game go down. It was very clear on that day you were the better team. If it comes down to a spot where it's either Georgia or Oregon for that fourth spot, Georgia would have the head-to-head there, and Georgia would, I think, emphatically be the selection. Now, here's my opinion. I think a one-loss Michigan would get in over a third-place Georgia team in the SEC. Again, this is a conversation that we have. People sort of decided at the end of the day, but I think that conversation gets a whole lot more difficult if you're Georgia in third place. Now, if you're in second place, I think the two scenarios I mentioned with the ACC and the Big 12, that helps you in the head-to-head with the Pac-12 becomes a reality as well. So for Georgia, if they lose this weekend to Tennessee, the predictor index, rather, for ESPN has them at a 31% chance to make the playoff. 31% is not great odds, to put it simply. So let's shift our focus over here to Tennessee. What if Tennessee takes a loss this weekend in Athens to Georgia? They're not favored in the game. We picked them to win the game, but besides that, the public doesn't believe they're winning the game, if that makes sense, if we're going to go ahead and phrase it that way. So let's say that Alabama wins, and let's say that Georgia ends up losing in the SEC title game. You with me? So we got a one-loss champion Alabama, you have a one-loss Georgia, and you have a third-place Tennessee. So this is what Tennessee's resume would read as. 5 ranked wins, and your one loss to the number 3 team in the country. Not a bad resume. So, with that being said, you're looking at a third-place Tennessee team. Here's the potential resumes that you're up against. You have a one-loss Big 12 champion TCU, 6 ranked wins, and a non-ranked loss, or 5 ranked wins and a ranked loss to, let's just say, Texas, for example. Texas is ranked right now. They're still on their schedule. That would probably be the best loss, quote-unquote, that they have available. Another potential resume you're up against, a one-loss Oregon. 5 ranked wins. Their one loss is to the common opponent of Georgia. So this kind of matters. Then how do you play this weekend against Georgia? Let's say you lose 50-3. Well, then actually Oregon has the better loss there from a margin of victory standpoint. I don't think that's going to be what happens. Vegas doesn't think that's what's going to be what happens, but it's something to look at nonetheless. You'd have the common loss there. And I think playing better against Georgia than Oregon does probably leans your direction. This is an interesting one. A one-loss Clemson as the ACC champ would have then 4 ranked wins. Let's be generous and say they end up playing a ranked team in the ACC title game. Let's just, roll with me here. That's a generous. It's probably going to be closer to 3 ranked wins. But then you have that one unranked loss. So they don't have any ranked teams left on their schedule. I'm not saying they couldn't eventually get there, but that's the way it looks right now. So you'd have an unranked loss and 4 ranked wins. Again, remember, Tennessee, 5 ranked wins and a 1 loss to the number 3 team in the country, depending on how close that is. I actually like Tennessee over all these teams. You can push back on that. There's probably a conversation to be had. I promise you, if this becomes a scenario, there will be a very spirited debate within that college football playoff committee, but it's a conversation. It's a conversation that we would have to have. I actually also like Tennessee over the loser of Ohio State, Michigan. A lot of talk about getting 2 Big Ten teams in. Listen, if it's Ohio State or it's Michigan that's on the outside looking in and they're not the Big Ten champion, here's what they have to their name. 2 ranked wins, and you didn't win the conference. No, nothing cut out there. We're still live on air. Your machine works just fine, but that's the reality for the Big Ten right now. And some of that maybe comes down to the eye test, and you say, well, hey, Michigan was really dominant over Penn State, and there's a conversation about style points. I get all of that. I understand it. And that might be why you would side with the Big Ten there. But if you're looking at the numbers and you're looking at the ranked wins, it leans Tennessee. So if you want to have that whole doomsday scenario that I don't think anybody is really rooting for outside of these respective fan bases, 3 SEC teams in the playoff, it would have to be Tennessee in one of those spots to have 3 of them. If it's Tennessee and Georgia's in the 3rd place, and Tennessee's that 2nd place team in the SEC, it's probably not going to happen. But all that's to say, there is very much a path for Tennessee to make the playoff regardless of what happens this Saturday in Athens. All right? And there's going to be a lot of people that say, well, you're based in Nashville. Of course you're saying this, right? You got ties to Grant Firking, who's at Tennessee. Okay, I hear what you're saying. I grew up in California. I went to school in upstate New York. Like, I'm the farthest thing from a homer here, right? Like, I love college football, all right? That's the whole thing I want to talk about right now. There's no dog in the fight here. That's the reality. ESPN has a 44% chance for Tennessee, if they lose this weekend in Athens, to still make the playoff. So is it likely? Probably not. Is there a path? However narrow it may be, it exists. We'll leave it at that. Hey y'all, thanks so much for watching. Subscribe to the channel here to make sure you don't miss an episode of The Hard Count. Also be sure to check out other videos on the On3 YouTube channel.